and that will make Stanley's head dominating the screen.
Yeah.
Well,
okay.
Thank you very much to David and Tan for inviting me to speak. I'm really excited to be here. The work that this group does is really so important, and I'm really happy to be able to join the voices and to join the work that's being done with the Sephardic World Group. What I would like to do is, for the first about 20 minutes or so, just describe the history of Jewish settlement in Jamaica, since I'm sure it's not very well known to many of you, although I'm sure many of you also are very familiar to the story. But I'd like to just give a narrative of Jewish 18th century settlement in Jamaica, and at least the way I see it. And then I would like to spend about another 20 minutes or so describing the sources that I used to reconstruct this history, that is the Last Will and Testaments written by Jamaican Jews in the 18th century, and also point to some of the ways that they can be used by genealogists and how important they are for the genealogical record of Portuguese Jews and Ashkenazim and other Jews in the Caribbean in the 18th century. So the history of Jewish settlement in Jamaica really belongs to the Portuguese Jewish Atlantic, the history that's known as sometimes as the Western Sephardi diaspora, or as the Nassau, the Portuguese nation. The reason that is because of very unique circumstances that affected Portugal and Western Europe. So to quickly just describe this so that we all have the same context, is in 1580, the Spanish annexed Portugal. And what that meant is the conversos that were living in Portugal, many of whom were crypto Jews because of the unique circumstances in 1497 of a mass conversion of Jews to Catholicism in Portugal, meant that this annexation meant in 1580 that sincerely Judaizing conversos could now cross freely into Spain and mingle with the largely sincerely Catholic converso population of Spain at the time. And from there, trickle through the Pyrenees, over the border into France, where they began to settle in cities like Bordeaux and Bayonne, where they basically lived openly as Jewish, even though they were only allowed to live there as being Portuguese conversos. But really the French turned a blind eye to Jewish settlement in Bayonne and Bordeaux and other places in southwestern France. And then from there, they would trickle into Protestant Western Europe that had extended tolerance to openly professing Jews, especially Amsterdam, which becomes the hub of this Western Sephardi diaspora. Then later on, you have settlements in Hamburg and in London and Livorno, which has a very specific privilege offered to Portuguese Jews to settle there. And the New World is all part of, that is North America, the Americas, North America and the Caribbean are parts of this Portuguese diaspora. I like to call it a Portuguese diaspora because it reflects rather than a Western Sephardi diaspora. And the reason is because the language is very different than in the Eastern Ottoman Mediterranean world, where you find people speaking in Ladino and things like that. In the Portuguese world, in the Atlantic, you really don't have things like Ladino. The language is Portuguese. The documents, the communal documents are written in Portuguese. The language that they're speaking is Portuguese, and they don't call themselves Sfaradim. They call themselves gente de linaje, or something like some kind of men of lineage or men of the Nassau, men of the nation. So they identify as being Portuguese. And the real difference between this Western Portuguese diaspora and, let's say, the Sephardi diaspora of the Mediterranean, and not exclusively so, but really is the heritage of having been a converso in Portugal. And that's true. This is not geographically identified too, because you have a lot of people who are Portuguese conversos who end up in the Ottoman world too. So it's quite a complicated story, but for these reasons, I like to call it a Portuguese Atlantic diaspora. And this is really the context where Jamaica fits in, and why Jamaica is such an important part of Jewish history, even though it's really such a small population, because it's part of this much broader network of communities that's really quite global, that extends all the way to wherever the Portuguese are, including the Southeast Asia and West Africa. And this is the real Portuguese diaspora. Okay, so how did Jews come to Jamaica? These Portuguese Jews. So it really begins with the settlement in Amsterdam following 1580. And then there's this slow trickle of Jews into Amsterdam, and then the development of Jewish community in Amsterdam. And part of that expansion is into the New World. So especially to Brazil, where the Dutch conquered Portuguese Brazil, the northern part, Pernambuco, around 1630. And there is the development of a Jewish community in Recife in Pernambuco, a port city in Brazil. And so that ends up being quite a large Jewish settlement. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this story, where there are rabbis, Eitzheim trained Portuguese rabbis like Yitzhak Abu Abde Fonseca, who serve in Brazil, and who and are able to also really help the rejudaization process in Brazil. So you have a lot of conversos who are living under the Portuguese in Brazil, and when the Dutch come and they take the northern part, it really helps to stimulate a very rapid process of rejudaization, because now these conversos who are living in Brazil can just openly identify as being Jewish if they wanted to. Now, in 1654, the Portuguese take back Dutch Brazil, and this leads to migrations into the Caribbean. So most of the Jews had already left, by the way, in 1654. Those that hadn't largely go back to Amsterdam, or they go to Livorno, and then some of them cross the Atlantic again, and they begin to settle in the Caribbean. So places like Suriname and Martinique and Barbados, which already had a small Jewish community, began to develop these Portuguese communal life rather than, let's say, individuals who had come to the Caribbean. Now, about 8 months after this expulsion and from Brazil, the English take Jamaica as part of a millenarian, that is messianic attempt of Oliver Cromwell to take the Spanish Americas away from them and to put it under a Puritan British control, so that is to defeat this Catholic Spanish. So it's a very religiously motivated event that's known as the Western Design. The idea was to take Hispaniola, which was really well fortified, that is modern day Dominican Republic in Haiti, which these Puritan zealots failed to take, and so they took Spanish Jamaica instead, which was very much less fortified. The Spanish had really not exploited the full resources of Jamaica very much. They had only really settled in the northern part of the island. They hadn't really planted very much in Jamaica. They were devoted more to cattle raising. So now in 1655, Jews could technically settle openly as Jewish in Protestant British Jamaica. And that's what happens very, very slowly. So we don't really know Jews settling, and there are individual Jews who come to search for minerals and things like that in the 1660s, but real Jewish communal life begins to develop in Jamaica only in the 1670s. And it's in the 1670s when there is religious tolerance extended to Protestant dissenters and others, including Jews, to live in Jamaica. So Jamaica, especially the port city, Port Royal, becomes a really noteworthy city for its ethnic diversity, its religious diversity, and its extension of tolerance to Protestant dissenters of all kinds. So Huguenots are settling there, and Moravians and Quakers and all kinds of people. So it's really a real melting pot of all kinds of different religious and ethnic ideologies, including a small community of Portuguese Jews. So it's a place where they could receive the status of denizens if they hadn't already been naturalized by an act of parliament in England. So that's one way of having citizenship, but the other way is to apply for denization in Port Royal, which required a small fee and allowed you to basically trade freely, and to you could take cases to court, you could own land, you could own slaves. That's what being a denizen got you, but what it didn't get you is that you still had to pay the alien tariff. So you had to pay higher taxes on your imports, and you also could not extend that status in perpetuity to your descendants. So if you were a denizen, that status died with you. And Jews could furthermore not participate in any kind of civic government. So they couldn't serve on juries, couldn't practice law, they certainly couldn't sit on the assembly, definitely not be part of the governor's council, which was part of really the extension of the monarchy in Jamaica, as opposed to the assembly, which was locally elected. And so there were a lot of disabilities that Jews faced in these early years in Port Royal. On top of that, they were also subject to several discriminatory efforts from non-Jewish merchants to curtail the efforts of Portuguese Jews who were trading throughout the Atlantic. They would be importing finished goods from England and then clandestinely selling them to the Spanish Americas, and very much in defiance of the law at the time, and also with the Dutch world, which was at war with the English. And so to trade with the Dutch was also illegal. So the Jews were involved in all kinds of surreptitious kind of trades in the late 17th century in England, and they were also really very much more successful than a lot of the English merchants. And so English merchants were using anti-Semitic rhetoric to curtail Jewish activities, trading activities in Jamaica. And this was similar to Barbados and others. But one point that I want to make, and a point that I make in the book, is that Jews weren't exclusively merchants in Jamaica. They were also planters, even in this early period. And it's sort of a false bifurcation to think of merchants as being something different than planters, because a lot of the times merchants simply invested their profits into estates. And so it's hard to disentangle something that I found. It's hard to disentangle the agricultural interests of the island from the mercantile interests of the island. They were all very much connected. So, and I feel that's an important point to make, because often the historiography and the scholarship tends to portray Jews as being these monolithically mercantile-minded traders, but I think it's a more complicated story than just that, especially in someplace like Suriname, when Jews were living in plantation settlements. So I think looking at Jews as a planter class helps to refine the way we understand their presence in the Atlantic. So the things really started to change for the Jews of Jamaica after 1692, like it changed for everybody. So in June of 1692, a massive earthquake led to a tsunami, which destroyed the city of Port Royal. And several Jews were killed. There's all kinds of interesting accounts of Jewish reactions to this event. Some of the Christian accounts want to believe that Jews started to convert en masse as a result of this calamity. I find that to be hard to believe, especially since they joined together with Barbados planters to ask for more privileges as a result of this destruction. So there seems to have been even more Jewish cohesion in some ways as a result of this calamity. And what you start to see is not a full abandonment of the city of Port Royal, but a shift in the gravity of life of Jews in Jamaica towards the capital of Spanish town, San Diego de la Vega, and towards the mercantile capital of Kingston, across the harbor. So where Jews had already been ferrying their dead to bury near the city of Kingston in the Ligony Plain, which is the cemetery of Hunts Bay, which is in modern day, part of the outskirts of modern day Kingston. So there was already a kind of a settlement there, and by 1704, you have synagogues that are being built in both Spanish Town and in Kingston. So you have a real change in the in where Jews are located as a result of the earthquake. But another really important result was even more anti-Jewish hostility. So this manifested in a Jewish tax that was levied on the Jews as a community of Jamaica. So every year, the 12 officials of the community would have to collect taxes and then give a special Jewish tax, discriminatory, prejudicial tax to the assembly as a almost like what you see the Dhimma in the Islamic world doing, a kind of tax to live there as Jewish. The tax is heavily debated, and this also leads to a very aggressive Jewish lobbying effort that's across the Atlantic that involves figures also in Amsterdam and the Jewish community of London in order to reverse this discriminatory Jewish tax. And that ends up being really one of the main, one of the most fascinating things that I found is this, the legacy of the Jewish lobby to rescind the Jewish tax was one of the most, I would say, ultimately successful, but one of the most articulate and aggressive Jewish lobbying campaigns in the, not only the Atlantic world, but maybe in the 18th century. Similar to Bohemian Jewry and others that were able to marshal forces to lobby for their own rights. So it wasn't only a story of discrimination. One very interesting episode in this tax is around the year, between the year 1733 and 1740, the Jamaican militia was engaged in a war with Maroons in the northeastern coast. So Maroons were former runaway slaves or semi-autonomous former slaves that lived in these communities in the north, and they had acquired gunpowder and were fighting the Jamaica militia and some ragtag group of redcoats, so to speak, from the British regulars. This is known as the First Maroon War. And Jews were implicated during the war for selling gunpowder to the Maroons, which may be true, may not be true. It's a very, that to me isn't the important part. What's interesting is that this claim that was given over in an interrogation of a former slave was fully believed by the assembly, and it really affected Jewish status on the island, thinking that the Jews were trying to undermine the British presence by supporting the Maroons in the north. And so this really sort of in the mind of many of the colonial elite only supported their notion of taxing the Jews at a higher rate than others because they were a fifth column and they were untrustworthy, and Jews don't have allegiances to local places, but Jews have allegiances only to profit because they look to Jerusalem or some kind of other locality as their homeland, really. So it's this is an anti-Jewish canard that became very popular in Jamaica around the time of the Maroon War. Ultimately, the first Maroon War ends in a peace treaty between the English and the Maroons, whereby the Maroons would agree to return any of the runaway slaves, and then they would then be allowed to live relatively autonomously in the North Coast. And this becomes sort of the status quo throughout the 18th century. And it's around the same time that the Jewish tax was abolished officially. Now, this is something that I get into great detail about how this actually happens in the book. But in 1740, the Jewish tax is abolished. And also another major development happens from England that helps to alleviate a lot of the pressures that are on the Jewish community in Jamaica, and that is the passage of the so-called Plantation Act, which granted citizenship to not this denization, but naturalization, so that was able to be, let's say, bequeathed to your children in perpetuity. This was granted to Jews living in Jamaica if they pledged to reside for 7 years in the colony. And now it also abolished a sacramental oath, which meant that Quakers and Jews were the greatest beneficiaries of this act that allowed Jews to benefit from naturalization. And Jews in Jamaica, by far, were the ones who applied, much more than Jews living in North America or other British settlements like Barbados or New York at the time. So this really helped to, this was a catalyst for a rising population of Jews in Jamaica, and also for a period of what I describe as optimism of Jews in Jamaica who were now beginning to participate in Jamaica's transition into a plantation economy around 1740. That is really trying to de-emphasize the mercantile efforts of places like Kingston and try to really aggressively build the plantation economy and join the sugar and other commodities, but mostly sugar market in competition with Saint-Domingue under the French. And so they far outstrip other British colonies like Barbados in the sugar production. And of course, the shift towards a plantation economy came with slavery, an increase in slavery, which was really the engine that drove the Jamaican economy. In the 1740s and 1750s, this period of plantation Jamaica, a period I characterize as one of hope and optimism for Jamaica's Jews. Jews fully embraced the plantation ethos of the island. That is, they were slave owners like everybody else, and they showed no distinctiveness in their slave owning patterns. They were as brutal as anybody else. And so that's a really, and they have a lot of the same issues about the ratio of black to white people on plantations. And so this is something that I deal with a lot in the book, the nature of Jewish slave ownership. And it's something that it's a hard reality to have to face, because a lot of the historiography has been one trying to shy away from the realities of Jewish slave ownership. In some ways, let's say, characterize Jews as being as being kinder slave owners, or in some extreme cases rejecting the notion that Jews are even own slaves. And so there's, I think it's really important to address this reality of Jewish slave ownership and what it meant. And it had some really interesting and important ramifications for Judaism, Jewish ethnic identity, and those are things that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So this is the period of plantation Jamaica, and it was a time of hope, as evidenced by a man named Sanchez Morao, who decided to vote for his member of assembly, which was illegal for Jews, right? You can't cast a vote for a member of assembly. But he argued that he had been naturalized by the Plantation Act in 1740, and that should empower him to have the same rights of it as every other naturalized citizen and cast a vote for an assembly. And this led to a real anti-Jewish thunderstorm of rhetoric, of anti-Jewish rhetoric and sentiment in the island. So on the one hand, it reflects a kind of Jewish optimism about living in Jamaica, and on the other hand, a harsh reality that Jews were very much different than the white leadership of the white elite of the island. In fact, something that I talk about in the book is that they have, in terms of their privilege in Jamaica, it's identical in many ways to the free people of color. They, almost the exact same disabilities. Sometimes they're able to transcend those disabilities in individual cases, but really free people of color and Jews have a lot more in common than Jews have with the white planter elite, and obviously then with the black enslaved population, for whom Jews are owners like anyone else, right? So that's something really important to consider. Now, as we move into the 1770s and 1780s, 1790s, leading up to the era of Jewish emancipation, which happened in Jamaica in 1834, but beginning in a process that begins in 1826. But the late 18th century is one of decaying the Jewish privilege on the island. It's a time, and it's sort of, to my mind, a little bit surprising to think of the era, the decades leading up to Jewish emancipation as being ones of actually very regressive policy and regressive types of sentiment. I'm learning though recently that apparently was happening also in Suriname at the time, leading up to emancipation there in 1825. So it tends to be something that is leading up to Jewish integration into island, a period of great hostility. So I'll give you some examples. Number one is in the 1760s. As you know, the British are in a terrible war, a global war with the French called the 7 Years' War. And this has theaters in the Caribbean, theaters in India, theaters, of course, throughout Europe and in North America, where it's called the French-Indian War. So during the early 1760s, Jews are very much feared to be in league with the French. This is because of a long history of Jewish-French connections in Jamaica, where the city of Bayonne, because of the process that I described earlier of the rejudaization process, provided much of the Jewish leadership. And during the 7 Years' War, Jews were victimized. Many Jews were victimized, thinking that they were somehow having an alliance with the French. They were incarcerated. Some Jews, their properties were stripped, and so they were sent into debtors' prisons, interrogated to reveal information about the location of the French fleet and things like that. So the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, was traumatic in a lot of ways for Jamaica's Jews that were perceived to be French. Some other examples are in 1783. You have the first moment of real anti-Jewish violence in Jamaica when a mob threatens to burn down the synagogue on Yom Kippur during Kol Nidre. Now it doesn't happen. Someone yells fire, and everyone scrambles. So but the threat was there, right? The threat to tear down the synagogue in Kingston. This really was a message to the Jews in Jamaica that things aren't so rosy, that there is a serious regression of how localized they thought themselves to be in Jamaica in this period. Another example is the uncle of Moses Montefiore. Joshua Montefiore shows up in Jamaica in 1787, and he wants to practice law. He's an adventurer and a fascinating character on his own right, but he shows up, he wants to be a solicitor in Jamaica, and 60 lawyers bring a case against him that he can't practice law because he's Jewish, right? And this ends up being a real interesting court case in Jamaica, whether being Jewish would prevent you from practicing law. And this is an interesting case too, because it seemed to suggest that in Jamaica, there were some hostilities that were even greater than what was being seen in London or England at the time, where Jews were practicing as solicitors. So these are just some examples of what, in my mind, seems like a real loss of optimism and hope. There's lots of anti-Jewish rhetoric in the Columbian magazine and other periodicals at the time, and it manifests in a real population decline. So Jews start leaving the island. They start going to North America and to other Caribbean islands. And so there is a sort of, the beginnings of some migration out of Jamaica in the period immediately leading up to emancipation. The 1780s was especially difficult, 1780s, 90s, and then leading into the early 19th century. And this is because the Haitian Revolution, the American Revolution, and series of really devastating hurricanes in Jamaica begin to really decimate the trade economy. And so you start to see things in Jamaica. The Ashkenazi community begins to affect its own independence from the Portuguese majority. The populations begin to decline. And during the Napoleonic Wars, really the Caribbean trade economy begins to deflate in serious ways. And then as you move into the 19th century, you find a very different demography of Jewish life in Jamaica than what you had in the 18th century when there was a Portuguese majority. So in the 19th century, more Jews from the crumbling Ottoman Empire, especially Lebanese Jews, as in Lebanese Christians, are migrating throughout to the Americas. Jamaica is a destination for a lot of Lebanese Jews. And today, this is for the genealogists among you, today, Lebanese Jews are some of the most prominent. And the Jamaican Jewish community, names like Haddad and Matalan is what you'll hear when you consider Jamaican Jewry. And this is part of a Lebanese Sephardi migration. Ashkenazim become far more numerous, especially leading up to World War II and immediately following World War II. And so, even though the various attempts to preserve Portuguese inflection in the way you pronounce Hebrew or Portuguese rite were still present even in the early 20th century in the communal minutes that exist from the 20th century. The Portuguese had lost their dominance, cultural Jewish dominance, in over the course of the 19th century and early 20th century, and that's why I periodize the book in the way I do, and dealing with the long 18th century from the 1670s really through 1815 because of this period of Portuguese Jewish Jamaica. Okay, so that's my quick narrative of the history, the bare bones history as I see it of Jewish settlement in Jamaica. I've tried to periodize it in the book, and this is because I find that in earlier studies and earlier research, scholars tend to talk about Jewish Jamaica, the 1670s and the 1680s in the same breath as they talk about the late 18th century. And I felt that there was some room to look at the vicissitudes of Jewish life in Jamaica, the flexibility, the ebb and flow of Jewish status over time. And so what I would like to do for this another 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes at the most, if I still have time, right, David? Am I good?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Is to talk about the documents that are at the heart of my study, and that's Jewish last will and testaments. Why did I choose these documents and what did I learn from them? So the reason, as Ton mentioned earlier, the reason that I decided to study last will and testaments is because there are no communal sources from Jamaica in the period that I study. The reason for this is that in 1883, December of 1883, there was a massive fire in Kingston that destroyed the two synagogues, the two Portuguese synagogues there at the time, which meant the records inside were also lost. And then the community begins to keep records again, and then those are lost in 1907. So the records between 1883 and 1907 are lost yet again in a major earthquake in January of 1907, which is what I'm writing about right now, if anyone's interested. So so what this means is there are no communal records from Jamaica, and this makes it very unique in a lot of ways. If you study the Jewish community of London, or you study the Jewish community of Livorno or Amsterdam, you have access to all kinds of communal records. And by that, I mean, especially Pinkase Kihila, that is communal records, where Jewish communities write down the various ordinances and issues that are being discussed by the communal board. These exist in abundance after 1750 from Suriname. They exist from Curacao, though they haven't been fully studied yet. And they certainly exist voluminously in Amsterdam and in London. So most Western Sephardi communities have Portuguese minutes. And also things like copiadores de cartas, which are records of the letters that are sent between communities. And these are major features of communal records. Things like rabbinic sermons and even things like that are all part of what you would look at an archive of a major community like Curacao or Suriname or in Amsterdam. Jamaica doesn't have these records because they were lost. So what does it have, really? And it doesn't have very much. So there are some letters, intercommunal letters, that are kept in other communities like London, but they are unidirectional and they often don't tell you very much. So in the absence of these kind of records, what do you have? And you have last will and testaments. So I was able to, and because the community is small enough, we're talking about at its height, only really 1,000 people, it becomes possible to collect all of the wills, which would be a very difficult task in a larger community. So in Jamaica, this was possible. So I managed to collect the wills of what I believe to be every 18th century Jewish probate will. And in the end, it's 450 wills. These are probated, which means that they are very far removed, and this is for the genealogist here, right? They're very far removed from the actual voice of the testator, him or herself, because what happens is you write a will, you sign the will, and then you give it over to the notaries. And then when you die, after your property has been inventoried, and those inventories exist, but they tend to be very dry lists of assets. But once your property has been inventoried, then the notaries, and this is a British system, the notaries come and they copy down the will. Now they're very careful to note like where the page breaks are and where the signature is. And this is the document that is on public record today and kept at the Island Records Office in Jamaica, which is right outside of Spanish Town, which is a fascinating place to work for all of its own reasons. So these wills were fascinating. Now, genealogists tend to use wills all the time, and they'll use one will or two wills. They use a family of wills. And what I wanted to do is look at the wills of a whole community, and from there try to identify the points of connection between where an individual meets a family, where a family then comes in contact with the community, and then where a community has a confluence then with the whole diaspora. And this is the way the strata of that I apply to looking at wills. And from breaking down the elements of wills that I had, I was able to draw conclusions about really a wide variety of different aspects. One aspect is the idea of public piety, what I call testamentary piety, right? How do Jews identify communally? Well, you don't have very many aspects of theology or ideology that are part of wills, but what you do have are these communal connections, things like asking for escavot, which is like the Portuguese way of saying hashkavot, which are memorial prayers, which become very important connections with your communal identity, or asking for a burial, making specifications for how you want to be buried. So the wills become a very important corollary and companion text to the surviving tombstones that Tom had mentioned earlier, right? You have Jews, we have the tombstones, the trilingual tombstones and all of their iconography, but then you'll have a will where a testator says exactly what kind of marble they want, where they want it shipped from, and they don't tell you the text that they would like on the tombstone, but they give you some sense of, sometimes they'll tell you, I want priestly imagery like that you find on tombstones and things like that. So that's like that is really important in of itself, but in a wider world of historiography, wills help to really fill in a lot of the gaps that communal records might have told you. So for instance, the process of rejudaization. How do Portuguese new Christians, right, who sometimes can be removed from Judaism for several generations, right, who may not really know much about rabbinic Judaism at all, sometimes find rabbinic Judaism to be shockingly unfamiliar to themselves. How do they begin to incentivize the process of re-Judaization, and to what extent are conversos considered among the family? That is, what is the confessional fluidity of openly identifying Jews, and how they see people who are still Catholic as being part of their family. So one thing that I look at wills are attempts to incentivize migration to Jamaica from people living in Portugal or in the Spanish Americas where they can't live openly as Jewish. And that is something that also begins to involve the Jewish communal boards. And so now we're starting to fill in the missing gaps of how Jewish communal life and family life existed in Jamaica, even without those records. It says a lot about the public role of women. I write a lot about this in the book. To what extent does widowhood empower or disempower women? To what role do they act? To what extent do they act as executors of estates? How much do they benefit? How much do they inherit actual real estate versus slaves and things like that? That's all very important information that can be gleaned from study of wills. And then finally, I'll just mention this, and then I'll turn it over to you, is the study of creolization, right? At what point do Jews become hybridized and localized within their Caribbean context? They're living Portuguese Jews who have a very strong ethnic identity as being Portuguese, but they also are living within a slave society where it's more or less socially acceptable to live in what I call unofficial families of color, where they're blending with women, living with women of color, having children with them, and in some ways, those children become incorporated into the Jewish family. So the wills are an extremely important metric by which to try to assess what is the role of Jews of color in the Caribbean, within the family, within the community. Now, there's been recent work on Suriname where you have a lot more records, much more specific about this. And so you have, that's a really rich place to study this specific question. But what I find in Jamaica is it's very common for Jewish men to give inheritance to their children of color, which they'll call reputed or natural children of color. And you can, so in some cases, there are open efforts to try to convert them. These are often coercive. So sometimes they'll say, I give this inheritance to my reputed child, who is the son of this woman of color, who is they'll use the term a mulatto or quadroon, or these kind of racially definitive terms that are used in Jamaica to describe people's degree of ancestry to a white progenitor, and they'll give this inheritance, but it's on the condition that they be brought into the faith of Moses, or that they be educated in Judaism. And often when those clauses are included, they disempower the mother from having anything to do with the education. So that says a lot about the very complicated role of Jews of color within the family. This has been described, and by the way, I'll say it's not just single men. The vast majority of cases are single men who don't have a Portuguese wife, that is, a Jewish wife, who are living unofficially with women of color and having children with them in these families. That's not to exclude cases of rape and other things that are just, the fact that you're living in a slave society, it's very hard to ascribe any kind of sentiment to this, to these relationships. But they're most often single men, but you also have a lot of cases of Jewish men who are married, who could be involved in situations of surrogacy or things like that, where they also have a bywife or concubine that are part of the estate that the children inherit. In one case, a married Jewish man appoints the bywife, a woman of color who he's living with, who has children with, as the executor of the estate. So she has a status that looks very similar to a pilegesh in Jewish law. So there's a lot to be disentangled in terms of where halacha, that is Jewish law, factors into these relationships. And I'll say that my conclusion about these kind of relationships, how articulate they are in Jewish wills, is in line with what one scholar, Aviva Ben-Or, describes as peripheral inclusion. So that is that that there is some level of inclusion into the family through inheritance, through recognition in wills, yet it's often very peripheral. So I'll give you one case study and then leave you with that I think says a lot about the role of Jews of color in Jamaica. And we know a lot more about this in Suriname, but there was a very important, prominent Jewish man, Emmanuel Baruch. His house is the one that's depicted here in the cover of the book. He made his very long will, and he had 4 sons. One of his sons was Aaron Baruch Lutzada, who he gave the same amount of inheritance as his other 3 sons. So if you just read the will, there was no reason to think that there was any distinction between these 4 sons, and that they were all on the same playing field, so to speak. But then several days later, he adds a codicil to the will, where he says that even though Aaron Baruch Lutzada is just my reputed son, so let's assume that means a person of color. That may be a problematic assumption, but in most cases, that's referring in a slave society to a child of color. Even though he's just my reputed son, he still gets that inheritance. And if anybody challenges that, then they're going to lose theirs. So he puts a threat in this codicil to protect that inheritance to Aaron Baruch Lutzada. And then you learn later on that he also gets an additional inheritance that was a bequest from his aunt, Grace Lopez Torres. So you have the will of Grace Lopez Torres. So look in that will and you find there is the bequest that was given to this child, Aaron Baruch Lutzada. And in that will, you find that she refers to him as her adopted son. So that tells you more of the story. that you can surmise that Aaron Baruch Hutzada was being raised apart from his father's household and his aunt's household, and then was included in the will without distinction, but then that was a source of family tension. So this says everything, I think, about the place of children of color and Jews of color, and maybe you could assume also of Jews of color communally in Jamaica, that there is this layer of inclusion. He was given inheritance with no distinction to his other brothers. I have reason to think that he was buried in a Jewish cemetery, which means that he would have had Jewish communal status. But at the same time, his inclusion was a point of conflict, and it wasn't seamless. He seemed to have been raised in another household, and there's all these layers of difference as well. And I think peripheral inclusion is a very good way of defining the status. That's Aviva Benor's term, which she gets into much greater detail in Suriname, but which in Jamaica are only hinted at on a familial level or on the level of testamentary bequests. So this is the kind of things that I've done with wills, and why I think they are useful documents. And I will stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. First remark, the picture on the front of your book has the house of Baruch Lusada, I believe. Yes.
That's right, Emmanuel Baruch Hutzada.
Yeah. There was a question about Jews of color. Where did the phrase come from? And when was it used for the first time?
Using the term Jews of color.
Yeah.
So that's a really good question. That's the terminology I like to prefer. I prefer to use, and that is because as something that Aviva Benor points to is that it's very problematic to apply, let's say, purely halachic criteria to who is Jewish in slave societies. Is a much more complicated dynamic at play. Not to mention that that Portuguese Jews have largely ethnic definitions of Jewishness that often transcend halachic definitions of Jewishness. This, I argue, is a product of their converso experience. So that's why I find Jews of color to be a helpful terminology, because you know, it helps, it reflects that ambiguity and hybridity of slave society, Jewish identity, and so that's why I find it to be a useful term. But it's not. But obviously, it has to be deconstructed. It's not something that.
Yeah.
But when is it first used? That's something I'm not sure about. I can tell you I'm working in the 20th century now, and this is still an issue. Who's included and who's not included in the 20th century along lines of skin color still really factors into Jewish communal identity. So, so that said, I think it's a term that really scholars apply to the past.
Another question is, what did Jews do for work when they were not planters or not merchants? Were they servants, etc., etc., workers?
There's really a wide range of occupational identifications that are connected to Jewish testators. These are very problematic at the stations because they're offered by notaries and not by the testator themselves. So when a notary calls someone a merchant, that could mean a lot of different things. And I think a lot of previous generation of scholarship often took that to mean, you know, they're big international traders and things like that. And it's really much more variegated than that. So merchants can mean a lot of different things. But obviously Jewish trading activity. That said, Jewish trading activity is the predominant occupation. There's a lot of Jewish distillers, Jews that are involved in manufacturing alcohol. There's a lot of reasons for that, partially because of high tariffs that are placed on imported sugar and things like that. So Jews are alcohol producers. Jews are planters, Jewish physicians, and so that's something I talk a lot about in the book because they're really important part of any community. Are Jewish physicians and surgeons, and those aren't always the same thing. There are rabbis in Jamaica, or there are communal functionaries, and there are dance teachers, flute teachers, you name it. So it's really important not to, let's say, to homogenize Jews in the Caribbean as being these kind of exclusive merchants.
Yeah.
David, I'm wondering if I could also see everybody. It helps to.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Oh yeah, that's better.
Trying to plug your book with my poor spelling.
That is very much appreciated, but I also like to connect.
Yeah. There was a question about the Cordova family, especially about Phineas de Cordova, who went to the Americas. What do you know about him?
I actually don't. I've written about the de Cordova, but you say like Pinchas de Cordova. Mm-hmm. That name actually doesn't ring a bell to me, and so that's just my own, that's my own personal lacking. But what I could tell you about the de Cordova family is that they were Ottoman Sephardim. So they had left as like Migurashim. They had left as Jews from Spain and settled in the Ottoman Empire, and then they made their way back. And so this is why East and West in Sephardi diaspora is very a problematic terminology in my mind, because it seems to imply that there's a geographic definition here, and there isn't, because so many of the rabbinic personalities that serve in the Caribbean, especially Shadarim, who are the emissaries that travel from the Holy Land to the Americas and have a very important rabbinic presence, they're actually Eastern Sephardim, but they're operating in the Western Sephardi world. So that's why I tend to avoid that kind of terminology. But the de Cordova is a good example. They are Ottoman Jews who come to the Western Sephardic world, and Joshua Zakkai de Cordova is a student at Eitz Chaim Yeshiva in Amsterdam, and he also studies with Yitzhak de Pinto in Amsterdam, the great Enlightenment economist figure. So he ends up being the rabbi in Jamaica, and he serves for over 40 years. I think he's the longest serving rabbi in any one location in the Caribbean in the 18th century. So it makes him a very important figure. And he's also very productive in his writing and quite prolific, really. So so that said, I think it's his grandchildren or grandnephews that end up becoming the founders of the Gleaner Company, which produced still the widest circulated newspaper in Jamaica today, the Daily Gleaner. And they are also really important in the theater world. So the de Cordovas become theater promoters. Jamaica has in the 18th and 19th century, Jamaica has an extremely vibrant theater culture, which, by the way, is what attracts Michael Leone, the great opera singer, the Ashkenazi opera singer in London, to Jamaica. So the de Cordova family becomes major patrons of the theater, actors, directors, producers. They do everything. So there's been some research on de Cordova connection with Jamaican theater culture. Phineas de Cordova, I'm sorry, doesn't. I don't know if I've come across that individual.
Okay. Another question. I have a question of myself about the wills, and Stefan Delgado has also a question about that. And my question is, did you also look for wills in other places like London or Amsterdam?
Yeah, that's a great question. I did not look in Amsterdam. This was just the nature of what research was available to me. Surely there may be Jamaican wills that are probated in Amsterdam. But I did look in London, and the National Archives, not in London, but in Kew, the National Archives have extensive will record that includes wills from Jamaica, and they are most of the time, there are several of them, but most of those wills are also probated in Jamaica. The originals are at the IRO, and they're probated because someone's an absentee. They live in Jamaica, their property's in Jamaica, then they go to London, which was the goal, right, of all, all big planters, was to retire in your mansion in London, and then manage your estate from there. And a lot of Jews do that. So I think I may be wrong. I think I say this in the book. I think only 6 wills that I found in the National Archives were of Jamaican Jews that were probated only in London and not in also in Jamaica. I made note of when they were probated in both places in the footnotes, but I always use the record that's at the IRO, because that was the Island Records Office in Jamaica. That was the corpus of archival material that I was really working with.
Yeah. How can we access those last wills that you studied?
Good question. This is in the works. I can't give you any firm dates, but there's without getting into too much detail, the Island Records Office had a rather inconsistent reproduction policy when it came to these wills. It really required being there, and it took some effort. I don't know if Ainsley's here, but Ainsley Henriquez played a huge role in helping to be able to digitize them. So in the end, I have a digitized record of them all. And I have them, don't worry, I have them backed up in many different places. So, if there's a major earthquake or something, I'm not keeping them all in one place. And we're going to try to make them available.
Yes.
And that's something that's going to develop over time in connection with the UCI, with the United Congregation of Israelites in Kingston, and with Ainsley Enriquez. So something that we had talked about with I had talked about with the communal board in Jamaica, and the will is there. It's just going to it'll take some time to do it, but David and Ton, we should partner in this process and get them online. Now, I will say this, a couple hundred of them have been reproduced already as TypeScript versions that are available at the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. So those may be easier to get up, to make available. But they're a little bit problematic because they are, the will is already once removed from the testator because it's gone through a notarial probate process. And so now, and then the ones at the American Jewish Archives have then been retyped in the 1950s. And so now you're twice removed already. So you can imagine that this leaves a lot more room for human error.
We have to stress that those are not original wills, like you said in your talk. So you can't study, for example, signatures.
And my understanding also, Ton, is that something that you implied is that in Amsterdam you have original handwritten wills?
Yes, no, sometimes. A few handwritten wills. I can recall at this moment only one of them.
To be sure, the notarial drafts that I use are also handwritten and require orthography. They require a certain skill set to. They're not easy to read. They're still written in that sort of 18th-century notarial language, which is very formulaic. They have there are books of formulae that they use to make these oaths. That's why the notaries have to do it. It's legal red tape, just to make sure that inheritance goes to who it's supposed to go to. And also there are some restrictions on who can inherit, like there's limits on how much money children of color are allowed to inherit, but there's ways around all of that. So, the notarial legal infrastructures is its own kind of language. you know, and you know, and it's funny because it's often much more it's circumvented somewhat in the Spanish ones, and more often than not, there I've only seen maybe two that have significant Portuguese in them, but that is because Jamaica probably only has a Spanish notary. The language is a little different in that.
Yeah, the Amsterdam last wills are nearly all written by the notary himself, but the one for whom it was written up always signed himself.
Yeah,
and sometimes
so,
his wife signed also.
Exactly. Those. So yes, this is clear from the will record that the testator had to sign the notarial draft that was going to go into the probate record, but those don't exist either. So we actually, I don't think I've ever really seen an actual signature. The signatures that exist are the ones that were included in the probate record, which were then signed by the notaries would say signed by, you know, Emmanuel Baruch, and then they'll put an X where the signature went.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I only saw one handwritten last will, which was given to the notary who kept it dutifully. And there must be others, I'm sure,
must be others.
but not many.
I could be wrong about this. Livorno had a number of wills that were also registered with the Jewish community, and I suspect that was happening everywhere in the Western Sephardic diaspora, is that you had the option of registering your will with the probate court, so to speak, but also you could have done it through the Jewish community. And so I think in those cases you may have more original.
Yeah, but you can tell if it's written by the testator himself or by the notary, because the language of a notary is much more formal. And a handwritten will tends to be in several sentences, while a notary, I don't know if you noticed that, only uses one sentence. There's a lot of commas, but the entire will consists of one sentence only. And this was done because it was thought that it had more legal substance.
You've got to, you know, that's one of the big challenges to reading, and that's why I really think to study wills you needed to study all of them. You couldn't just look at a couple in isolation, because then you wouldn't really notice when there's something unusual, because you get so used to that notarial language of something. Once you read a lot of them, once any deviation from that language really really is like a flashing light, because you become so accustomed to that that formula.
I have a very nice question for you from Stuart. As a pioneer in putting together the story of Jamaican Jewry, what was the discovery that surprised you the most?
Thank you. I assume that's Stuart Schwartzbard, right?
I think so.
Well, welcome. He's an old, very old friend of mine who I'm happy to see here.
Yes.
The thing that surprised me, I think, the most is the importance of poverty. This is sort of the standard answer that I give here, and something I didn't really mention, but there's almost too much emphasis in earlier generations of scholarship on tolerance as being the primary motivation for moving to the Caribbean. And something I must say Aviva Benor does wonderfully in her new book too on it came out in the same month as mine on Suriname. She spoke here a couple of weeks ago, and she really gets into this, but not to say that religious tolerance wasn't a factor here. Of course it was, because why are they coming to Jamaica, not to the Spanish, Caribbean, right? They're coming to a place where they can live openly as Jews. But that said, that the poverty is really the number one motivation behind why Jews go to the Caribbean, and especially because some of the bigger communities, Amsterdam and London, are dispatching indigent individuals to the Caribbean in the hopes that they could then find greener pastures there, and also alleviate the stress on their own communal coffers, because they are overtaxed, especially in the 1720s and early 1730s, when a lot of Portuguese Jews are showing up completely penniless because of the a very problematic time, troubling time in Portugal itself. And so a lot of these Jews are then being sometimes coerced into accepting circumcision in order to go on to receive a travel grant, and then being shipped on to the Caribbean. And then they were often shipped to other places. So, they were shipped to Barbados, and then in Barbados they were shipped on to Suriname. So this is to say that the Jews that live in the Caribbean are, by and large, poor and recipients of social welfare. And that's a really big problem with studying wills, because wills are really a property elite. So they really cut away. You're really losing the voice of the majority of the community, who are much more itinerant, much less literate, much less inclined to make a will. And by the way, even people who are property don't leave wills. In the 18th century, like today, most people die intestate. That is, they die and then their estates become the subject of whatever law is in place at the time. So making a will is a way to bypass that, and to say that we're going to I'm going to divide my property up the way I want to. But to answer the question, the thing that is most surprising to me, because I'm the recipient of a tradition of scholarship that emphasizes the rich merchant, is that that's not the story of Caribbean Jewry. The story of Caribbean Jewry is the poor itinerant, and that's the story that needs to be told.
Okay. There are a few questions about the population of Jamaica. How many Jews were there? What was the proportion to British people there, and to the number of slaves?
Yeah, it's never very big, and it's really, I would say that the height, we're talking about only the highest estimate comes from a tally that was done on kind of unofficially in a newspaper in 1770s, and that is about 1,000, and it's estimated 900 so individuals. So I think you can fairly estimate there's about 1,000 individuals there in the in the late 18th century. That then declines as you move into the period of emancipation, and then after emancipation, it begins to grow again. So once by the turn of the 19th century, so like the early 20th century, there's easily nearly 2,000 Jews. So in the 18th century, it's really rather small. One thing, we only have very uncertain estimates in earlier periods, and one thing that you can do though is you can see the various waves of migration have a resonance with the population figures. So there's a little bump in migration after Suriname in the 1660s, when Suriname is taken by the Dutch. So those that were living there under the English go to Jamaica, and there's a little bump in the population. And then you can also see again in 1680s, after the passage of the Code Noir, whereby Jews were expelled from Guadeloupe. They'd already been expelled from Martinique, but then officially from Martinique and Guadeloupe, and then to a lesser extent in Saint-Domingue. Then there's a bump in the population that's suggested by the documents. And so that's to say, we're not talking about very many. It's much smaller than Curacao. It's always a bit smaller than Suriname. And so it's not the biggest Caribbean community at all, but it's much bigger than all of North America put together. So, that's the thing. That's the other story that needs to be revised here, that the story of Caribbean Jewry needs to be emancipated itself from the margins of American Jewish history, because it's always been seen, like Jacob Bader Marcus and even my mentor and dear friend Eli Faber, who recently passed away, always sort of saw early Americanists tend to see Jamaica and the Caribbean as being this sort of, the first chapter in the colonial American experience. But that's a backwards way of looking at it in a lot of ways, because North American Jewry is quite insignificant in the 18th century when compared to Jamaica alone. So it's definitely the biggest population of Jews in the English Atlantic, apart from London itself.
Okay. A few more questions, David, before we...
I actually have a question myself, because within the Caribbean, what's the relationship, say, between people living on English islands like Jamaica and people living on Dutch islands like Curacao, and people living, of course, in the North American colonies? I mean, are they all sort of Portuguese style going back to the center, or are they sort of communicating with each other?
This is I think you may have touched on one of the most important essential questions really in the study of this early Atlantic history. It's one of the benefits of applying a model of Atlantic history is to say that people transcended nation borders of colonies, colonial borders, right? So, and that's very true of the Portuguese diaspora. So I always tend to think of this as being, there's one metropole for all Jews in the Atlantic, and that's Amsterdam, because Portuguese Jews see themselves as very ethnically homogenous. They are Portuguese. They don't want to marry even Ashkenazim. They're extremely exclusive. And so I always see, the thing that unites Jews living in the Dutch world with Jews living in the English world is that they both equally, I believe, look to Amsterdam as the true metropole, as in Eitz Chaim and the board and the rabbinic establishment of Amsterdam as really being so that's to say they're not exactly imperial as much as they are diasporic. And that's the key to understanding how they transcend these borders. Now that said, I don't think all scholars really agree with me on this, and and that's fair, but I really tend to think that imperial borders did not matter very much to the Portuguese Jewish diaspora. But that said, local colonial localities are very important in producing singularities and differences between them. So there's very different, let's say, citizenship infrastructure that's offered to the Dutch than what's offered to the English, right? The nature of the Jewish tax in Jamaica makes them extremely distinctive, and also in Barbados, than what's happening in the Dutch world, where that doesn't really factor in to that story. There's I believe that there are important differences in the way that the Surinamese community operated vis-a-vis Jews of color than they did in the English Caribbean. So I think that there are some really important differences that are rooted in locality, but that don't necessarily have to do with imperial borders. And I think a good evidence of that is that the way that they're perceived by the colonial elites, right? Jews are often seen. So one thing I find in the English world is the Board of Trade in London or the Crown-appointed governor. It will often refer to Jews as Hollanders, and why? Because because they all have a connection in some way with their metropole, which is Amsterdam. Now that begins to change over the course after 1740. I argue in the book, London starts to play a much more dominant role in the lives of Jews. That isn't the case in the early part of the 18th century. There's much more fluidity into where the Jews are looking for patronage, so to speak. But the way that this really matters is that, and this has been at the heart of really great scholarship done by Jessica Reitman and also Aviva Ben-Or, is how Jews negotiated the various entanglements of authority that they were living under. So, if you were, you have, let's say you're a Jew in Curacao, you have your own communal board. The Ma'amad there in Willemstad has direct authority over what's going on there. But then there's the colonial authority in Curacao, and then there's the leadership of the West India Company that needs to be negotiated in Amsterdam itself. And then there's the Jewish Communal Board in Amsterdam. So there are all these different layers, which in a lot of ways empowers Jews in the Caribbean, because they have like sort of a choice in some ways of where they could go to negotiate certain privileges. And when one system fails them, they have another one to go to. So that's true in a lot of ways of the English Caribbean, but it manifests in very different ways that are also important to.
I think you can see a layer of center and cities and other places that are just below that, and from these places, other places are colonized. In my thinking, the first New York community dwindled very fast. It was settled from Brazil in 1654, but by 1664 there was not much left. Only one Ashkenazi Jew was still there. And in my view, New York was resettled by 1680, especially by Jews from the Caribbean, and even more especially from Jamaica. Do you see anything of that in these wills?
Yes, I do see important North American connections. I agree with you 100%. I think the same story is true of Newport, where there's like two separate settlements that one dies and another one comes. They're not part of the same continuum. And that's been a flawed way of looking at the colonial American history of these colonies having sort of one community that existed there in perpetuity. That's not the case. There is there's a lot more of elasticity to the way that Jews settle in these colonies. And New York is a great example of that. Your model of like center and periphery is, I think, a very good way of holding up something to maybe the strong man to tear down in a way, because that's been the way that everyone looked at this Western Sephardi diaspora. There's this center, there's Amsterdam, and then there are these peripheries, these concentric circles where, let's say, maybe London and Hamburg after that, and then you have these places like Livorno on that line, and then you come further out, and then there's places like the Americas and Bayonne, maybe the crypto Jewish community of Antwerp. So like there's these these concentric circles, and the further you go away from the center in Amsterdam, the less like rabbinic authority there is, the less authority say the Ma'amad has in Amsterdam. And I think that a lot of my book included, and a lot of the more recent scholarship is trying to find more like equality between these different layers, right? That the colonies weren't just these clients of centrifugal kind of patrons like of Amsterdam, but rather they were working in a much more mutually exclusive type of partnership. And so that's where I see, I try to, one thing I play with in the book is challenging the idea of center and periphery, right? When Jews in Jamaica are always connected to Bayonne, when you put those communities together, how important is Amsterdam and like its influence on the whole diaspora. So I think that there's some room to play with that model a little bit. But the question was North American connections, and yeah, they're there. I mean, Aaron Lopez famously had strong mercantile ties to Jamaica specifically. So that's the merchant prince, the most famous person in colonial American history. Aaron Lopez in Newport had family living in Jamaica, and his letters are full of Jamaican contact. And so that's, and one interesting case is our friend Joshua Hezekiah de Cordova. He shows up in the communal minutes in New York where he's complaining about the meat that was being imported from New York to Jamaica, that it wasn't being sealed well enough, so they couldn't trust that it was properly kosher. Now that begs the question, why was the huge Jewish community of Jamaica, which had its own butchers for sure, because Edward Long tells you that they did, why were they importing kosher meat from the tiny community of New York, right? So that's something I always wondered, but there were definitely strong connections, especially within the English sphere of influence. And that's
Yes.
partially because the English were very protectionist in the way that they conducted trade. It was forbidden to import any kind of sugar from outside the American colonies, and they had navigation acts that restricted what you could trade with the Dutch. So it was certainly trading with the Spanish was off limits. So there's the English tend to be very protectionist, which leads to a kind of internally English type of trade network. But the Jews are always defying it. So it's hard to decide whether that means that they had this sort of imperial bubble or not.
Yeah. Questions keep pouring in still. My suggestion would be that we answer them by mail after this in the coming days, because we could go on endlessly now. And maybe we should wrap it up, David.
Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, that was quite fascinating. And anyone, Tom, I can see your face. This book is my copy arrived a couple of days ago. Absolutely excellent book. Well worth reading, and it's quite brilliant in terms of genealogy. It shows what you can do when you don't have the main records, and there's often workarounds.
I'll just say, David, right, if you don't mind me interrupting for one moment, I'm sorry. The index in the book, I don't have every individual that's mentioned in the text doesn't show up in the index. If you show up more than once, then you definitely make it in the index, or someone that, even if you show up once, but I thought you had important connections other ways. But the index is still a useful resource for genealogists if you're looking for individuals. And I also just want to say this: I'm very easy to find online. If you just Google my name, you'll find my stanley.mirvis@asu.edu, and I'm happy to receive questions by email. And everyone here is welcome to just email me directly.
That's really kind. Thank you. So moving on to next week, we are going to do something very different. We have Judith Cohen, who's a musicologist who is known to many of us here, and she has spent a lot of time in Portugal, including in the crypto-Jewish communities such as Belmonte. And next week she's going to be talking to us about the music in the lives of those communities. Obviously, in the Western Sephardic world, we have our beautiful liturgical music, but I think we've lost what we might describe as our folk music. Sorry, I'm going to be a schnorrer. Just to remind everybody that we can only do this through your help, and many thanks to those who do help. A number of people have asked if they can make one-off payments. Patreon is a monthly payment. If it's at all possible and people can help, a monthly payment is better because it helps us taking out subscriptions, to Zoom and to other services. But we are working on one-off payments for those. And of course, if you can't afford, then your presence is really all that we ask for. And just also to say that Ton and myself are working as professional genealogists, obviously especially working with those applying for Portuguese citizenship. And if you need any professional help, this is a build service. Feel free to contact us at contact@sephardicgenealogy.com. So we will unmute everybody who has.
A great thank you to Stan.
Yes, of course, I've got it.
and a lot of people are joining in on chat to give their thanks. So it was a really nice presentation, and maybe
Thank you
can
guys,
come back again
fantastic.
sometime.
Thank you very much.
I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you very much. It was real.
Thank you.
You.
Amazing, thank you.
Thank you, Stanley. My book's on order.
So,
Thank you.
right, so shall we,
Thank you.
shall we, we've been over an hour and a half, so many thanks to everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next week, and we look forward to hearing about Stanley's next project when it's reached completion. So, Tom, anything else to be said?
No, it's a good night, everyone, and see you next week.
Okay, many thanks. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Great talk.
Thank you.